A veteran drove 1,200 miles across the country with nothing but hope and a faded photograph, searching for the military K-9 he thought he'd lost forever. What he discovered when he finally arrived would shatter him, and then rebuild him in ways he never imagined. Because sometimes the ones we search for have been searching for us too, waiting in the shadows, never giving up, never forgetting. This is the story of Marcus Webb and Titan, a bond forged in war, torn apart by circumstance, and reunited by something far more powerful than chance. The morning air in Greenfield, Oregon, carried the scent of damp earth and motor oil, a combination that had become as familiar to Marcus Webb as the ringing in his ears that never quite went away. He stood in the open bay of Holloway's Auto Repair, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag that had long ago given up being clean, his eyes fixed on the rusted pickup truck parked just outside, the only thing he owned that still ran, though barely. 32 years old, broad-shouldered but leaner than he used to be, Marcus moved through the garage with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned to ration energy the way others rationed money. His hands were steady despite the tremor that lived in his left one, a souvenir from an IED outside Kandahar that had taken more from him than just nerve function. It had taken his hearing in one ear, 3 men from his unit, and eventually, in the chaos of medical evacuations and rehab rotations, it had taken Titan. Titan! The name still landed heavy in his chest every time he thought it. A German shepherd with eyes like amber and a bark that could stop a charging man in his tracks, Titan had been Marcus's partner for 2 tours. They'd cleared buildings together, searched vehicles, walked point on patrols where every step could be the last. Titan had saved his life twice, once by detecting an explosive, once by standing between Marcus and a man with a knife who got too close during a riot. And Marcus had promised, in the way soldiers promise things they can't control, that he'd never leave him behind. But the system had other plans. After the blast, Marcus was medevaced to Germany, then stateside to Walter Reed. Titan was transferred. Reassigned, they said. Standard protocol. Marcus had tried to track him through the labyrinth of military bureaucracy, forms, phone calls, emails that disappeared into the void. By the time he was discharged, medically retired with a folder full of prescriptions and a limp he'd carry forever, the trail had gone cold. That was 3 years ago. Now, Marcus worked part-time at Ray Holloway's garage, fixing transmissions and replacing brake pads for $70 a day under the table. He lived in a single-room efficiency above the dry cleaner on 4th Street, a place where the walls were thin enough to hear arguments and sitcom laugh tracks in equal measure. The rent was cheap because the heat barely worked, and the landlord, a man named Gil who smelled like stale beer and bad decisions, had made it clear that cheap didn't mean negotiable. Marcus was 2 weeks behind. Gil had left a note under the door that morning, written in block letters on the back of a pizza coupon. Friday or out. That gave him 4 days. He'd been calculating it all morning while rotating tires and replacing air filters. 4 days meant 2 more shifts here, maybe a side job if he could find one. And if he skipped meals and walked instead of driving, he might scrape together enough to cover what he owed. It would leave him with nothing, but nothing was better than nowhere. Ray Holloway emerged from the office, a broad man with silver hair and hands like catcher's mitts, wiping his own palms on his coveralls. "Marcus, you good to close up tonight? I got a thing with my daughter." "Yeah, no problem," Marcus said, his voice low and even, the kind of voice that didn't ask for much and didn't expect more. Ray paused, studying him the way he sometimes did, like he was looking at an engine that wasn't firing right but couldn't quite figure out why. "You eating enough?" "I'm fine. That's not what I asked." Marcus met his eyes, then looked away. "I'm fine, Ray." Ray grunted, unsatisfied, but didn't push. He clapped Marcus on the shoulder once, hard enough to feel like faith, then walked out. Marcus returned to the truck, tightening bolts in silence, his mind cycling through numbers and days and the edge of the cliff he'd been walking for longer than he cared to admit. The work kept his hands busy. It didn't keep his mind quiet, and it definitely didn't prepare him for the email that was waiting on his phone, unread, from someone named Sarah Mitchell. Subject line, "About Titan." Marcus didn't see the email until nearly 6 that evening, after Ray had left and the last customer had rolled out in a newly aligned sedan. The garage had fallen into that particular kind of quiet that comes when machines stop running, a stillness that felt almost unnatural, like the world holding its breath. He sat on an overturned crate near the tool bench, his phone in his hand, the screen dim and smudged with fingerprints. He'd pulled it out to check the time, maybe scroll through nothing just to fill the space before locking up, when the notification caught his eye. Sarah Mitchell, about Titan. His thumb hovered over the screen. For a moment he didn't move, didn't breathe. The name alone was enough to stop him cold, like hearing a voice from a dream he'd been trying to forget. He opened it. "Mr. Webb, my name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a veteran advocate working with a network that reconnects former handlers with retired military working dogs. I believe we may have located Titan. He was transferred after your discharge and has been living with a foster coordinator near Fort Carson, Colorado. If you're interested in more information, please call me as soon as possible. Time is sensitive. Sarah." There was a phone number at the bottom. Marcus read it twice, then a third time. His heartbeat had shifted, not faster, but heavier, like something inside him had woken up after years of sleep. Titan, alive, in Colorado. He stood pacing the length of the garage without realizing it, the phone still clutched in his hand. His mind was already moving. Fort Carson was over 1,000 miles away. 1,200, maybe more depending on the route. That was 2 days of driving if he pushed it, maybe 3 if the truck held together. But the truck needed gas. And gas cost money. Money he didn't have, money he owed to Gil by Friday. He stopped pacing and stared at the oil-stained concrete floor, jaw tight. The math was brutal. If he used what little he had saved to make the drive, he'd lose the apartment. No question. Gil wouldn't wait, wouldn't care about a dog or a promise or anything that didn't come in the form of cash folded into his hand. Marcus looked at his phone again. Reread the line. Time is sensitive. His chest tightened. What did that mean? Was Titan sick? Being moved again? Reassigned to someone else? The email didn't say, and the not knowing clawed at him worse than any injury he'd carried home. He could call, ask for details. Maybe it wasn't urgent. Maybe he could wait, save up, go in a few weeks when he had his rent covered in a little breathing room. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was a lie. There was no breathing room. There hadn't been for years. And if he waited, if he let caution win, he'd spend the rest of his life wondering if he'd missed his only chance. Marcus sat back down on the crate, elbows on his knees, phone resting in both hands like a grenade. He wasn't sure whether to throw or hold. He thought about Titan's eyes, the way they'd lock onto his before a mission, full of focus and trust. He thought about the weight of the dog's head resting on his boots during the long waits between patrols, the only comfort either of them had in a place built entirely of dust and danger. He thought about the promise he'd made. I won't leave you behind. And he realized, with a clarity that felt both terrible and freeing, that he'd already made his choice. Marcus stood, exhaled slowly, and hit the call button. It rang twice before a woman's voice answered, calm and professional. This is Sarah Mitchell. This is Marcus Webb, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. You sent me an email about Titan. There was a pause, then warmth flooded her tone. Mr. Webb, yes, thank you for calling. I know this must be overwhelming. Is he okay? He's alive. He's healthy. But Marcus, she hesitated. He's been waiting a long time, and the family fostering him can't keep him much longer. If you want to see him, it needs to be soon. Marcus closed his eyes. I'm coming. I'll leave tonight. Tonight? Sarah's voice shifted, cautious. That's a long drive. Are you sure? I'm sure. He hung up before she could say anything else, before doubt could crawl back in. Marcus grabbed his jacket, locked up the garage, and walked to his truck without looking back. Marcus left Greenfield just after 8 that night, the sky bruised purple and fading fast into black. The truck's headlights carved weak tunnels through the dark as he merged onto the highway heading east, the engine growling with the rough, uncertain voice of something that had been asked to do more than it was built for. He'd stopped at his apartment only long enough to throw a few things into a duffel bag. 2 shirts, a toothbrush, the photograph he kept in the drawer beside his bed. It was creased down the middle and faded at the edges, but the image was still clear. Marcus, in his desert fatigues, kneeling beside Titan, one hand resting on the dog's shoulders, both of them squinting into the Afghan sun. He'd taped it to the dashboard before pulling out. It stayed there now, flickering in and out of shadow as the miles peeled away beneath him. The first night was the hardest. Not because of the distance, but because of the silence. The truck had no working radio, and Marcus didn't own a phone charger that fit the ancient auxiliary port, so there was nothing but the hum of the road and the occasional rattle from somewhere deep in the engine that he chose not to think about too hard. He drove through eastern Oregon and into Idaho, the landscape opening up into flatness and stars, the kind of emptiness that made you feel both small and strangely free. He stopped once for gas outside of Boise, paying with the last $20 bill in his wallet and watching the numbers on the pump climb with the sick awareness that every gallon was a piece of his future he wouldn't get back. By the time he crossed into Wyoming, the sun was rising pale and cold over the plains, and Marcus had been awake for over 24 hours. His eyes burned, his back ached, the tremor in his left hand had gotten worse, the way it always did when he was tired or stressed, and he gripped the steering wheel tighter to steady it. He pulled into a rest stop outside Cheyenne just before noon, parked in the far corner of the lot away from the RVs and the families stretching their legs. He sat there for a long moment, staring at nothing, then reached into the bag on the passenger seat and pulled out a protein bar he'd taken from Ray's office. It was stale and tasted like cardboard, but it was all he had. He ate it slowly, mechanically, watching a family unload from a minivan nearby. 2 kids, maybe 6 and 8, chasing each other in circles while their parents laughed and called after them. The kind of normal that felt like it belonged to a different species. Marcus looked away. His phone buzzed, a text from Ray. "You disappear on me? Gil came by the shop asking where you were, said you owe him." Marcus typed back with one thumb. "I know, I'll figure it out." Ray's response came fast. "You better, he's pissed." Marcus didn't reply. He turned the phone face down on the seat and closed his eyes, just for a minute, just to rest them, and when he opened them again, the sun had moved and 45 minutes had passed. He swore under his breath, started the engine, and got back on the road. By the time he hit Nebraska, the truck was making a new sound, a high-pitched whine that spiked every time he pressed the accelerator. He ignored it. He had to. Stopping meant mechanics, and mechanics meant money he didn't have, and money he didn't have meant turning around, and turning around meant giving up. So he kept driving. He thought about Titan constantly now, wondered if the dog would recognize him, wondered if 3 years had been too long, if the bond they'd shared had faded the way everything else seemed to fade when you weren't looking. He thought about the last time he'd seen him, being led away by a handler he didn't know, looking back over his shoulder, ears forward, confused. Marcus's jaw tightened. His knuckles went white on the wheel. "I'm coming, buddy," he said out loud, his voice cracking in the empty cab. "I'm coming." The road stretched on. The whining in the engine got louder, and Marcus Webb, broke and exhausted and running on nothing but a promise he'd made in a war zone half a world away, drove through the night like a man who had finally found something worth losing everything for. Marcus crossed into Colorado just after dawn on the 3rd day, the mountains rising in the distance like teeth against a pale sky. The truck was running on fumes, both literally and metaphorically. The whining from the engine had turned into a grinding sound that made his stomach clench every time he shifted gears, and the gas gauge had been flirting with empty for the last 30 miles. He'd called Sarah Mitchell from a gas station payphone outside Sterling, using quarters he'd found wedged in the truck's cup holder. She'd given him an address, a rural property about 20 minutes outside Colorado Springs, near the base, but not on it. A place where retired MWDs were sometimes housed temporarily before being adopted or reassigned. "Colonel Hartley oversees the program," she'd said. "He's expecting you." "Marcus," she'd paused, "I'm glad you made it." He hadn't told her about the truck, or the rent, or the fact that he'd been living on gas station coffee and whatever he could find in his bag for 2 days straight. He just said, "Thank you," and hung up. Now, as he turned onto a gravel road that wound through fields of dry grass and scattered pines, his heart was doing something it hadn't done in years. It was racing, not from fear or panic, but from hope, and hope was so much more dangerous. The property came into view slowly, a modest ranch-style house with a large fenced yard, a few outbuildings, and several chain-link enclosures where he could see movement. Dogs, several of them, pacing or lying in the sun. Marcus parked the truck and sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, trying to steady his breathing. This was it. After 3 years, after 1,000 miles, after everything. He stepped out. His legs were stiff, his boots crunching on gravel as he walked toward the house. Before he could knock, the door opened, and a man in his 60s stepped out, tall, lean, with silver hair cut military short and eyes that had seen enough to know better than to ask too many questions. "Marcus Webb?" "Yes, sir." "James Hartley." They shook hands. The colonel's grip was firm, assessing. "Sarah told me you were coming. Hell of a drive." "Yes, sir." Hartley studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the yard. "He's out back, third enclosure on the left." Marcus's breath caught. "He's here?" "Has been for 8 months. We've been trying to reach his previous handler for a while, but the records were a mess. Sarah finally tracked you down last week." He paused. "He's a good dog, loyal, but he's been waiting a long time." Marcus didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded and started walking. The enclosures were clean, well-maintained, each one holding a dog with the unmistakable bearing of a working animal, alert, watchful, scarred in the way only war leaves. Marcus passed the first 2 without looking, his eyes already locked on the third. And there he was, Titan. Lying in the shade of a small shelter, head on his paws, ears half back, older now, grayer around the muzzle, but unmistakably him. Marcus stopped at the gate, his throat tight, his vision blurring at the edges. "Titan," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The dog's ears shot forward, his head lifted, and then, as if pulled by something deeper than memory, Titan stood, slowly at first, then faster, and came to the fence. His tail wagged once, twice, then harder, his whole body trembling as he pressed his face against the chain link, whining low and desperate. Marcus dropped to his knees, hands reaching through the gaps, and Titan licked his fingers, his face, every part of him he could reach, the sound coming from the dog's chest, something between a whimper and a sob. "I'm here," Marcus whispered, tears running freely now. "I'm here, buddy. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." They stayed like that for a long time, the rest of the world falling away. But the world didn't stay away. Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again and again. Finally, he pulled it out. 3 missed calls, 2 voicemails, all from Ray. He listened to the first one. Ray's voice was tight, uncomfortable. "Marcus?" "Gil came by again. He's pissed, man. He cleaned out your place. Said you're done. I'm sorry. I tried to talk to him, but just call me." Marcus stared at the phone, then at Titan, then at the sky. He'd made it. He'd found him. And he'd lost everything else. Marcus sat on the tailgate of his truck for a long time after the call, the phone resting loosely in his hand, screen dark. The sun had climbed higher now, bright and indifferent, casting sharp shadows across the gravel lot. Behind him, he could still hear Titan pacing in the enclosure, whining softly, confused about why the man who'd finally come back wasn't staying. Colonel Hartley approached quietly, his boots crunching on the gravel in that deliberate way men of his generation moved, never rushing, but never wasting steps either. "Everything all right?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Marcus didn't look up. "Got evicted." Hartley was quiet for a moment, then he nodded, as if that made a kind of sense he'd seen before. "You drove all this way with no plan for after." It wasn't a question. "I had a plan," Marcus said quietly. "It just didn't include getting here." Hartley exhaled through his nose, something between a sigh and a laugh that held no humor. He crossed his arms and leaned against the truck beside Marcus, staring out at the same stretch of nothing. "You got anywhere to go?" Marcus shook his head. "Family?" "No, sir." Friends? Marcus almost smiled. Not the kind who have room. Hartley was silent again, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward but thoughtful, like he was turning over options the way a mechanic might examine an engine. There's a bunkhouse, he said finally. Used to be for volunteers, back when we had more of them. It's not much, cot, sink, space heater that works half the time, but it's dry and it's yours if you need it. For now. Marcus looked up surprised. I can't. You can, Hartley interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. And you will. You just drove across the country for a dog. That tells me something. And I've got an opening for someone who can help around here. Feeding, cleaning, basic care. Doesn't pay much, but it's something. Marcus stared at him, unsure whether to feel grateful or ashamed. Maybe both. Why? He asked. Hartley met his eyes. Because I've seen a lot of men come back from war, son. And the ones who still care about something enough to sacrifice for it, those are the ones worth keeping around. He straightened. Think it over. I'll be inside. He walked away, leaving Marcus alone with the sound of the wind and the distant whine of a dog who'd been waiting too long. Marcus moved into the bunkhouse that evening. It was exactly as Hartley described. Small, sparse, cinder-block walls painted beige sometime in the last century, a single window with a view of the field. The cot creaked when he sat on it, and the wool blanket smelled faintly of mothballs, but it was warm, and it was his. He unpacked his duffel, 2 shirts, a toothbrush, the photograph, and set them on the wooden shelf beside the cot. Then he sat there in the quiet, hands on his knees, and let the weight of the last 3 days settle into his bones. He'd lost his apartment, his savings, any illusion of stability he'd been clinging to. But he'd found Titan. And somehow, against all logic, that felt like enough. That night, Hartley brought him a plate of food, leftover meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and sat with him on the steps outside the bunkhouse. They didn't talk much. Hartley asked a few questions about his service, and Marcus answered in the clipped, careful way veterans do when they're used to people not really wanting to know. But Hartley listened. Really listened. And when Marcus mentioned the blast, the reassignment, the years of searching, Hartley just nodded. Bureaucracy's a hell of a thing, he said. Kills more dreams than wars do. Marcus almost laughed. Before he left, Hartley paused at the bottom of the steps. You can see him tomorrow. Spend time with him. We'll figure out the rest as we go. Marcus nodded, throat tight. Thank you, sir. Hartley waved him off. Don't thank me yet. You're going to be shoveling a lot of dog shit. Inside the house, Hartley sat at his desk, pulled out a worn leather address book, and flipped to a page marked with a faded ribbon. He stared at a name written in careful script, then picked up the phone. It rang 3 times before a woman answered. Sarah, Hartley said. It's Jim. He made it. And I think you were right about him. There was a pause on the other end. Then, quietly, good. Because Titan's not the only one who's been waiting. Hartley hung up, leaned back in his chair, and smiled for the first time in weeks. Marcus woke before dawn, the way he always did. Old habits carved into muscle memory by years of pre-dawn formations and patrol rotations that started when the world was still gray. The bunkhouse was cold, his breath visible in the thin morning light seeping through the window, but he didn't mind. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he'd slept without nightmares. He dressed quickly, splashed water on his face from the small sink in the corner, and stepped outside. The property was quiet, wrapped in that particular stillness that belongs to the hour before the rest of the world wakes. Frost clung to the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then settled. Marcus walked toward the enclosures, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his breath trailing behind him in small clouds. When he reached Titan's gate, the dog was already waiting, standing at attention near the fence, ears forward, eyes locked on Marcus like he'd been watching the path all night. Hey, buddy, Marcus said softly, kneeling down. Titan's tail wagged, low and cautious at first, then faster. Marcus opened the gate and stepped inside, and the dog came to him immediately, pressing his weight against Marcus's legs, his head pushing into Marcus's chest the way he used to after long missions, when the adrenaline finally wore off and all that was left was relief. Marcus wrapped his arms around him, buried his face in the thick fur at Titan's neck, and just held on. They stayed like that until the sun crested the hills. Later that morning, Hartley found Marcus in the yard, throwing a worn tennis ball for Titan. The dog moved with the practiced precision of a working animal, focused, efficient, returning the ball and dropping it at Marcus's feet with the same discipline he'd once brought to detecting explosives. "He hasn't played like that in months," Hartley said, leaning against the fence. Marcus looked over. "He remembers." "More than that," Hartley said. "He's been waiting." Marcus threw the ball again, watched Titan sprint after it. "Sarah mentioned that, on the phone. She said he'd been waiting a long time." Hartley nodded slowly. "When we first got him, he wouldn't eat for 3 days, wouldn't engage, just sat by the gate watching the road." He paused. "We thought he was depressed. Happens sometimes with retired MWDs. They lose their handler, lose their purpose, and they just shut down." Marcus's jaw tightened. "But then something changed," Hartley continued, "about 6 months ago. Sarah tracked down your records, found out you'd been looking for him. She told me about you, the calls you'd made, the forms you'd filed, the dead ends you'd hit, and I told Titan." He smiled faintly. "I know that sounds crazy, but I did. I told him you were out there, that you hadn't forgotten." Marcus turned to face him. And he started eating again, started engaging, like he understood. Hartley's expression grew more serious. "Dogs like Titan, they don't just bond with their handlers, they imprint. You're not just his person, Marcus, you're his mission, and he's been holding the line, waiting for you to come back and complete it." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, something he'd been holding closed for years. "There's something else," Hartley said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope, slightly yellowed at the edges. "This came for Titan about 2 years ago, from a veteran in Virginia named David Kozlov. He was Titan's first handler before you, before Afghanistan." Marcus took the envelope, confused. "Kozlov's dying," Hartley said quietly. "Cancer. He wrote to say that if anyone ever found Titan, if his current handler couldn't keep him, he wanted to make sure the dog was taken care of. He set up a fund, not huge, but enough. Enough for medical care, food, and a stipend for whoever became Titan's permanent guardian." Marcus stared at the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. "He never met you," Hartley continued, "but he knew what it meant to serve with a dog like that, and he knew that whoever loved Titan enough to search for him deserved support." He paused. "Sarah and I are listed as the administrators, and we both agree that person is you." Marcus looked up, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't understand." Hartley smiled. "You drove across the country with nothing. You gave up everything to find him. Kozlov would have done the same." He placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Welcome home, son. Both of you." Marcus stood there in the cold morning air, the envelope still in his hands, feeling the weight of it, not the paper, but what it represented. Money, security, a way forward. Things he'd stopped believing he deserved somewhere between the blast and the years that followed. He looked down at Titan, who sat at his feet now, calm and steady, those amber eyes watching him with the kind of patience that only dogs and soldiers understand. "I can't take this," Marcus said finally, his voice rough. Hartley's expression didn't change. "Why not?" "Because I didn't do anything to earn it." Marcus held the envelope out. I just came to see him, to make sure he was okay, that's all." "That's all," Hartley repeated, his tone measured but firm. "You drove over 1,000 miles with a truck that should have died in Idaho. You gave up your home, your job, everything you had, just to keep a promise to a dog." He didn't take the envelope. "Son, that's not nothing. That's everything." Marcus shook his head, looking away. "I didn't do it for money. I didn't even know there was money. I just—" He stopped, struggling to find the words. "I left him once. I didn't have a choice, but I still did it. And I've spent 3 years trying to fix that. This isn't about getting something back. It's about making it right." Hartley was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady and unreadable. Then he sighed, the kind of sigh that comes from a place of recognition, not frustration. "You know what Kozlov wrote in that letter?" Hartley asked. Marcus didn't answer. Hartley reached into his pocket and pulled out a second piece of paper, unfolded it carefully. He said, "The men who serve with these dogs don't do it for glory. They do it because they understand loyalty in a way the rest of the world has forgotten. If you find Titan's handler, don't insult him by calling it charity. Call it what it is, a debt paid forward by someone who knows what it costs to love something more than yourself." Marcus's throat tightened. He stared at the ground, jaw clenched. "This isn't charity, Marcus," Hartley continued, his voice softer now. "It's not a handout. It's a recognition. Kozlov knew that the kind of man who'd come looking for his dog, no matter the cost, is the kind of man worth investing in. Not because you're broken, but because you're still fighting." Marcus looked up, his eyes glassy. "I don't feel like I'm fighting. I feel like I'm barely hanging on." "That's what fighting looks like," Hartley said simply. "It's not loud. It's not pretty. It's waking up every day and choosing to keep going when every part of you says to quit." He paused. "You made it here. Against every odd. That's not hanging on. That's winning." Marcus's hands tightened around the envelope. He thought about the locked door in Greenfield, the empty apartment, the nights in the storeroom, and the mornings where he woke up wondering if it was worth it to get out of bed. And then he thought about Titan's face pressed against the chain link, the way the dog had looked at him like he'd never stopped believing Marcus would come. "I don't know how to do this," Marcus admitted quietly. "Do what?" "Accept help. Let someone care." He swallowed hard. "I've been on my own for so long, I don't know how to be anything else." Hartley stepped closer, his voice firm but kind. "Then let me tell you how. You stay. You work. You take care of these dogs, including yours. You let yourself heal. And when you're ready, when you're strong again, you help the next guy who shows up at that gate with nothing but hope and a dog's name." He met Marcus's eyes. "That's how you accept help. By becoming the kind of man who can give it." Marcus looked down at Titan again. The dog's tail wagged once, slow and sure. He thought about what Hartley said, about Kozlov, about the men who understood loyalty, about the cost of loving something more than yourself, and he realized that refusing wasn't humility. It was fear. Fear that if he let himself believe things could be different, they'd be taken away again. But Titan hadn't given up, and maybe that meant he didn't have to either. Marcus folded the envelope carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He looked at Hartley, his voice steady now. "Okay," he said. "I'll stay." Hartley smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need words. He clapped Marcus on the shoulder once, firm and certain. "Good. Now come on. There's a lot of dog shit to shovel." Marcus laughed, small, surprised, real. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like pretending. 6 months later, the property looked different. Not because anything major had changed, the fences were still chain link, the outbuildings still weathered, but because it had become something more than a way station. It had become a home. Marcus had settled into the rhythm of the work with the kind of quiet diligence that surprised even Hartley. He rose early, fed the dogs, cleaned the enclosures, and spent hours working with each one, walking them, training them, sitting with the ones who'd forgotten how to trust. He learned their names, their histories, the particular wounds each carried that didn't show on the surface. And Titan never left his side. The dog had regained weight, his coat glossy and thick again, his movements confident. But more than that, something had returned to his eyes. Purpose. He shadowed Marcus through every task, sat beside him during meals, slept at the foot of his cot every night. They'd fallen back into the rhythm they'd once shared in a desert half a world away, but this time without the weight of war pressing down on them. Marcus had changed too. He'd put on muscle from the physical work, but more than that, the tightness in his jaw had eased. The tremor in his hand came less often. He smiled more, not the forced kind he used to wear like armor, but something genuine, something earned. And he'd started talking. Not much at first, but during the long evenings when he and Hartley sat on the porch after the work was done, Marcus began to share pieces of himself he'd kept buried. Stories from his deployment, memories of the men he'd lost, the guilt he'd carried for surviving when they hadn't. Hartley listened the way good men do, without judgment, without trying to fix anything. Just present. "You ever think about what comes next?" Hartley asked one evening as the sun dipped low over the hills. Marcus looked at Titan, who was sprawled on the porch beside him, half asleep. "I'm still figuring out what comes now." Hartley smiled. "Fair enough, but when you're ready, I've got a thought." Marcus waited. "We've been getting more requests," Hartley said. "Veterans looking for their dogs, families trying to adopt retired MWDs. There's a need for people who understand both sides, the dogs and the handlers. People who've lived it." He paused. "I think you'd be good at it, helping them reconnect, guiding them through it." Marcus considered this, turning it over slowly. "You think I'm ready for that?" "I think you've been ready since the day you showed up here with nothing but a promise." A year later, the program had expanded. With the help of Sarah Mitchell's network and the remainder of Kozlov's fund, they'd established the Titan Project, a non-profit dedicated to reconnecting veterans with their former military working dogs and providing support for those who needed it. Marcus became its first full-time coordinator. He traveled to bases, met with handlers, navigated the bureaucratic maze he'd once been lost in, and helped other veterans find the dogs they thought they'd lost forever. Every reunion felt like his own, raw, overwhelming, and worth every mile. Some of the veterans had homes to return to. Others, like Marcus, had nothing. For those, the property became a temporary refuge, a place to heal, to work, to remember what it felt like to have purpose again. Titan was there for all of it. He greeted every new arrival, his calm presence a reminder that some bonds don't break, no matter how much time passes. One crisp autumn morning, Marcus stood at the gate where he'd first seen Titan through the chain link, where he dropped to his knees and wept. The memory felt both distant and immediate, like something from another life that somehow still belonged to him. A truck pulled up the drive, dusty, dented, running rough. A young woman stepped out, mid-20s, wearing a faded army jacket and the kind of haunted expression Marcus recognized instantly. "Are you Marcus Webb?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "I am." "I got a call from Sarah Mitchell. She said you help people find their dogs." Marcus smiled. "That's right." The woman's eyes welled up. "I've been looking for mine for 2 years. His name is Ranger, and I heard—" Her voice cracked. "I heard he might be here." Marcus glanced at Hartley, who stood in the doorway of the house, arms crossed, watching. He nodded once. Marcus turned back to the woman. "He's here, third enclosure on the left." She didn't wait. She ran. Marcus watched her go, Titan sitting calmly at his side. A moment later, he heard it, the sound he'd heard 100 times now but never got tired of. A cry of recognition, a dog barking, the collision of two souls who'd been searching for each other in the dark. Titan looked up at him, tail wagging slowly. Marcus knelt down, scratched behind his ears. "We did good, buddy." And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Marcus Webb believed it. Sometimes you don't find home. It finds you. And sometimes all it takes to change the course of a life is the willingness to drive a little farther than you planned, to hold on a little longer than seems possible, and to never forget the promises you made when the world was on fire. If this story moved you, honor it by sharing it. Hit like and subscribe to keep these stories alive, and let us know in the comments about the bonds that changed your life.